In my last video about Telltale Games, which I'll link to in the description, I briefly talked about the studio before they became the Telltale Games everyone knows. And then also talked about their post-The Walking Dead period. One user in the comments said that Telltale is no longer working on The Wolf Among Us 2. Naturally, I was quite interested to find out whether this was true or not, so I emailed both Ad Hoc Studio and Telltale Games to find out, and I got no response from either. I got ghosted by both. Ad Hoc Studio is currently busy with Dispatch, their first game under the Ad Hoc banner, and Telltale Games is AWOL, I guess? In any case, The Wolf Among Us 2 is still listed on Epic Games, and last I remember, it was being worked on in Unreal Engine, so maybe that's why Epic Games still has the game page up. Who knows? There are already countless of videos on YouTube on the rise and fall of Telltale Games, and this video won't deal with that. Instead, I'm going to focus specifically on what Telltale Games used to be before The Walking Dead and The Wolf Among Us came along, and why it was important for a very niche part of the gaming community. And for that, we have to start all the way back in the late 1980s. Fine, let's fast forward to the mid-90s then. By the mid-90s, Lucasfilms Games, a division of Lucasfilms of Star Wars fame, had rebranded to LucasArts and had already released some absolute bangers of point-and-click adventure games, including the very well-known Monkey Island series. A lot of the teenagers of that time were either Camp Sierra or Camp LucasArts in regard to which adventure game devs we supported. And although both studios had some exceptional developers at the time, I was vibing way more with LucasArts than I was with Sierra. The fact that by 1997 the ongoing fansite Mix and Mojo launched and dealt with all things LucasArts only helped in cementing the LucasArts cult. Right. The reason we started with the mid-90s was because I wanted to mention three key people, Dan Connors, Kevin Brunner, and Troy Molander, who had all worked on many LucasArts titles, both in making point-and-click adventure games as well as Star Wars games. By the late 90s, everything started advancing to 3D and most studios were still trying to figure things out. And LucasArts' first adventure game in full 3D was Grim Fandango, which is considered by many, and when I say many, I mean almost everyone from that era, as the best adventure game ever made. Of course, times change, audiences change, so this may or may not be an accurate view anymore. Disclaimers aside, all three aforementioned honchos, Dan Connors, Kevin Brunner, and Troy Molander, were part of Grim Fandango in one way or another, and were also part of the remaster released 10 years ago. Grim Fandango was released in 1988, and it took 2 more years for LucasArts to release their next 3D adventure game, which was Escape from Monkey Island, the first Monkey Island to be fully 3D. And the fans were somewhat underwhelmed. In fact, I mentioned it in my video of 7 games that kinda missed the mark, which I'll also link to in the description. The game did not do well in regard to critic reviews, and the sales were acceptable, but the fans weren't very happy with it. In 2002, LucasArts had announced that they were working on a sequel for 7 Max and for Full Throttle. The ones who were still around were excited, even though most of us had obviously moved on from adolescence by then and were experimenting with various... Anyway, by 2004, LucasArts had announced they were stopping development on both of these IPs and focusing more on Star Wars. The company also started firing people left and right as part of their restructuring. The LucasArts offices had turned into a doomwad, with the higher-ups firing everyone and their mothers. And by 2004, Telltale Games was founded by Dan Connors, Kevin Brunner, and Troy Molander, who I've already mentioned twice. Suffice to say that over at mixandmojo.com, people were supporting them even before they released their first game, which was Telltale Texas Hold'em, released around 6 months after Telltale Games was founded. It was mostly a sort of showcase for their newly created 3D engine that would go on to power all of their games up until The Walking Dead the final season in 2018. Their first proper game was Bone Out from Boneville, based on the comic book series by Jeff Smith. Bone Out from Boneville was an adventure game during a period when adventure games were rarely being made, as most companies considered them to be an archaic type of game design by then and avoided making them. We, the fans, had our own money by then, so we started supporting this new studio by ex-LucasArts devs, and we were all extremely excited when 2 years later they announced they'd be making a Sam & Max game. And on top of all that, it would retain elements from the one that was being worked on at LucasArts a few years prior, with most of the key people brought in to work on this new game. Now, I've mentioned Sam and Max a few times without explaining who they are. Sam and Max started out as a comic book in 1989 by a LucasArts artist called Steve Purcell, who later on went to work at Pixar. While he was at LucasArts, his Sam and Max duo got quite popular with his co-workers, so they decided to make a game based on them, which released in 1993 and was extremely successful. Sam and Max was also featured in LucasArts' The Adventurer magazine up until 1996. In 1997, 13 episodes of an animated Sam & Max show were released on Fox Kids, although the humor used in the animated TV series was a lot more kid-friendly than in the 1989 comic book or the 1993 game. Fast forward back to 2006 and Telltale releases the first episode of the new Sam & Max game, which got all the old LucasArts fans back on board. In fact, it proved to be so successful that the company went on to make another Sam & Max game and also managed to license Monkey Island from LucasArts, then under Disney, and make Tales of Monkey Island, which released in 2009. In 2010, a few months later, they released my favorite Sam & Max game, The Devil's Playhouse. And that game, for me, was Telltale Games at their peak, whereas Tales of Monkey Island that came before it was somewhat underwhelming for me. It was better than Escape from Monkey Island, that's for certain, but it lacked something that would pole vault it into the realm of classics. It was just there. Some other notable games between Telltale Games' inception and The Devil's Playhouse were Wallace and Gromit's Grand Adventures, which, although charming, also lacked a certain something that would make it stand out, and Strong Bad's cool game for attractive people, who was a character that started out as a proto-meme back in the day, and for some reason got a game made. Anyway, it was actually a fun game. The old fans were supporting the studio with every release, and we felt that our support was justified when Telltale managed to get the rights for continuing the Monkey Island story with one more game, and then with the excellent Sam & Max The Devil's Playhouse. Now, Telltale Games started in 2004, in a period when hard copies of games were still being sold in local video game stores, and yet they chose to go almost fully online, which helped reduce the costs considerably. The lower prices were also a great incentive to keep supporting them, and in return, they'd have the games we paid for on their servers for us to download, and would also send us a hard copy for our purchases when a game's so-called season would be completed, often with special covers or sleeves. By 2010, when The Devil's Playhouse was released, the industry had gradually moved away from hard copies and were starting to release games solely online, including stores such as Steam, Ubisoft, GOG, and Ever Fireflower Games, which was founded in 2011 and is still around to this day. In December 2010, Telltale Games released their first episode of Back to the Future the game, which, although it felt like it was playing it safe, again was a welcome addition to the Telltale roster. And fans who mostly grew up in the 80s when Back to the Future was released were excited about this, especially since some of the original actors were part of the game. The game wrapped up its episodic format by June 2011, and 5 months later, Telltale released a different kind of game, and that was their take on Jurassic Park. The game was largely choice-driven and relied heavily on quick-time events, or QTEs for short. The attempt was similar to the games Quantic Dream had been making with Fahrenheit and Heavy Rain, but on a much smaller budget. The game received average reviews, and the fans, well, they weren't too hot on it either. Telltale saw something different in it, though. Jurassic Park the game would serve as a blueprint for their future games, the first of which was The Walking Dead. The Walking Dead had refined the original choice-driven QTE type of gameplay and placed a heavy emphasis on drama. It was basically Fahrenheit and Heavy Rain with sometimes better writing. And since the gameplay was kept to a minimum, it meant that a lot more people would get to experience the product than the point-and-click adventure games that came before The Walking Dead and The Wolf Among Us. I like to call these type of games as on-rails adventure games, same way there were on-rails shooter games back in the day. The Walking Dead released in 2012, 8 years after Telltale was founded, and it became their trademark style after that, reaching its peak with The Wolf Among Us the year after The Walking Dead wrapped. And although in those first 8 years Telltale released a total of 19 games, some of which quite forgettable, it did manage to also leave us with The Devil's Playhouse and Puzzle Agent. I quite like the two Puzzle Agent games they released, although they're closer to the Professor Layton games than traditional adventure games. And this is who Telltale was before they became Telltale, and why they were kind of a big deal before they became a big deal. Which game was your first Telltale game? Let me know in the comments below, and consider subscribing if you like my content, as this would help me out immensely. Also, I've started a Discord server, the link of which I'll drop in the description below. So join us. It's free. Later.